of young and old. It's brutal. I spent, after high school, I wanted some money to go to college, and I was just dead broke, so I took a job panning for gold and prospecting up north, and I was driving back from a town where I went for a couple of drinks one night, found this Aboriginal woman staggering along the side of the road, brought her in and asked her what happened, and she said she was in the back of a pickup truck with a bunch of other guys. They wanted blowjobs. She wouldn't give them blowjobs. They threw her out of the car while it was still working, so of course they took her to the hospital, made sure she was okay, but man, it's brutal. So you see the Aboriginal kids in town wandering around in their underwear, like 2 o'clock in the morning, no clothes, it's cold. I mean, it's a brutal, decimated community. This is what happens when government power moves in, right? Human beings are like muscles that respond to resistance. When government moves in, resistance goes, the muscle goes, and atrophy sets in. In Canada, being Aboriginal means being poor generally, even very poor. 3.8% of the country's population identified as Aboriginal, and 21%, almost 22% had incomes below the low-income cutoff after tax. So it's almost double compared to the non-Aboriginal population. Employment rate of Aboriginal peoples being almost 10 percentage points below that of the non-Aboriginal population. Basic education, only 43.7% of Aboriginal Canadians have less than a secondary education compared to 23% for the non-Aboriginal population. Again, education is like training for a race. If there's not going to be any race, why would you train? Over 50% of all Aboriginal children were poor, the highest rate of all the three equity groups previously mentioned. Disability rate, more than twice the national average, more than 4 times likely to be hungry for Aboriginal children. So in 1988, amendments to the Indian Act empowered First Nations with their own tax authority, and today, according to this guy Wilson, about 1/6 of bands collect taxes. This will all be available, fdrurl.com/Canada, all the sources for this. So, the personal property of an Indian or band situated on a reserve is tax exempt. This is Métis and Inuit, or what used to be called Eskimos, not eligible for this exemption. A status Indian working on a reserve is exempt from income taxes, and status Indians do not generally pay the federal goods and service tax or provincial sales tax if they buy something on a reserve or if it's destined for a reserve. Off reserve, we all get stuck with it. Well, so do we. Okay, so every time someone leaves a reserve, the cost and obligation of the federal government for each of those individuals is reduced by about 80%. So this is one of the reasons why the federal government has no economic interest, in fact, every economic interest, to keep things really crappy on the reservation, because they're trying to drive people off to reduce the cost of ownership for these wretched souls. So this is sort of important. For every $8 spent on reserves, only $1 is spent on services to those 60% of the band members that lives off reserve. So again, the crappier it is, the more people they hope to leave, the less their cost is going to be. Crazy economic incentives. So you're grinding poverty, tainted water, not suitable for drinking or bathing, major housing crises, loss of language, extreme crime rates, rampant health epidemics, youth suicide rates 8 times the national average. For Inuit youth living in the Arctic, the suicide rate is 40 times the national average. I mean, these are the people who are drinking photocopy fluid just to get high. It's wretched. Now, this has been the result of pretty significant and savage government intervention. So for more than a century, education for on-reserve Aboriginal children was primarily provided through government-funded residential schools, where they were designed really to assimilate Aboriginal children in Caucasian culture and the churches. The children were forbidden to speak their own languages, practice their own spiritual traditions, or maintain their cultural traditions. Schools were usually too far from reserves to enable contact with parents. Siblings were separated in residence. Sexual and physical abuse and death from disease were rampant in these institutions. Children in these residential schools did not encounter healthy parental role models, to say the least, and they had diminished capacity to care for their own children. And the last residential school closed in Saskatchewan in 1996. The results has been parent functioning concerns, and so for alcohol abuse, 63%, for Aboriginals, 21%, and change for Caucasians. Drug abuse, 27 to 12%, criminal activity, 17 to 8%, cognitive impairment, 8% to 5.3%, mental health concerns, about equal, physical health concerns, about equal, and so on. So an 80.9% increase in the number of days that a First Nations children spend in group or institutional care during this period. This increase is dramatic when compared to the corresponding figure for the number of days spent in foster care, 37.4% increase. So government basically came in, as governments tend to do, is they decimate the family, they decimate the community. Families and communities, one of the primary purposes is to shield people from the natural hardships and rigors and challenges and problems of life. When the government comes in and takes over these, it weakens community bonds completely. Having the government around is like putting all of your limbs in a cast or going into space. All that happens is your muscles and your bones atrophy. You don't solve the problems. All you do is make people permanently dependent upon this kind of economic and legal shield. Fewer Aboriginal children aged 14 and under lived with two parents than did non-Aboriginal children. 32% of Aboriginal children and 46% of those on a reserve and 46% of those in metropolitan areas live with a lone single parent. Only 17% of non-Aboriginal children lived with a lone parent. I mean, the more welfare, the weaker the family. I mean, it's terrifying how easily the family unit was destroyed by the cultural Marxism of the left and this constant desire to intervene and muck about with ancient institutions. 5% of Aboriginals living in large urban areas lived with a relative other than their parents or lived with a non-relative. 12% of Aboriginal families are headed by parents under the age of 25. 27% are headed by single mothers. 40% of single Aboriginal mothers earn less than $12,000 per year. So this is, I'll just blow past this fairly quickly. The Aboriginals have lower rates of two-parent biological families, which is by far the best environment for children statistically. And if you look at, source of income, full-time employment for Aboriginals, 15.8% versus Caucasians, 42.9%. Benefits, Aboriginals are almost 60% of their income comes from benefits. For Caucasians, it's still a pretty wretched 37.7%. The average number of Aboriginal welfare recipients risen from 40 to 41% over a 10-year period beginning 88 to 89. 45% of Canada's First Nations social assistance is their only source of income. 34.8% of Indians on reserve received social assistance compared to 5.5% for the country's general population. This rate for on-reserve Indians was 43.9% in Manitoba. This is very significant because it means that they are now wedded to the government, and the government is a dangerous and terrifying entity to be wedded to. Welfare becomes a family's tradition like Sunday dinners. Instead of the children adopting the role of community hunter or healer or fisher or weaver, the occupation becomes welfare. A new family tradition is formed. Children learn from their parents. Social assistance has become an acceptable way of life for too many people and their families. While for centuries children have been encouraged to adopt the occupation of their parents, children of social assistance parents are now following in the footsteps of their parents, creating intergenerational welfare families, fewer capacities to negotiate in the free market and so on. It's just wretched. It's a death spiral. So a lot of the elders say welfare isn't a part of First Nations culture. They can recall the first person in their community to get welfare. Our community has never been the same, they say, and add, we used to help each other out, support ourselves, not anymore, not after welfare. Of course. Okay. So to commemorate the 20th anniversary of Parliament's resolution to end child poverty in Canada, Campaign 2000 released its annual report card on child and family poverty in Canada. Today in 2009, or then in 2009, an Aboriginal child is 12.3 times more likely to be in foster care than a non-Aboriginal child. While comprising only 3.8% of the Canadian population, poverty has resulted in Aboriginal children accounting for a staggering 30% of children in foster care. The situation is so grave that the number of Aboriginal children in the child welfare system today is 3 times the number of those enrolled in residential schools at the height of their operation. Horrendous. Okay, so obviously thank you so much for your patience in watching and listening to this presentation. This is really important. This plague of state growth, of debt, of fiat currency, of inflation, of vote buying, this clusterfrack of an ancient curse that was well understood in the ancient world. I mean, there was an old saying that as far back as you can really remember, that one of the problems with giving people the right to vote away other people's property is that the poor outnumber the rich, and the poor will vote to take away the rich's property until everybody becomes poor. That's only partly true. Of course, the rich are very politically connected, and the rich, of course, because the rich pay a higher proportion and a greater amount of taxes, the government really wants to listen to the rich, because the rich are the cash cows that allow them to pay off a lot of the poor. So this is particularly terrifying. My question to people who are skeptical of this process is, where does it end? Where does it end? Where does government debt end? Where does government inflation end? Where does intergenerational debt end? Where do unfunded liabilities end? Where does this end? How does this get resolved? There's no indication that this momentum is getting slower. In fact, it's getting faster. At this point, we must question the system as a whole. This is not the first time nor the last time this will occur in human history. Systems such as slavery, unlimited democracy, fascism, totalitarianism of various flavors, communism, various forms of extreme socialism, communitarianism, the sort of city-hating, agriculture worshipping of the Khmer Rouge and so on. All systems need to be open to question at their fundamentals, not tweaks, not adjustments, but at their fundamentals. Do we want to have a system where we have a centralized monopoly of violence that has the power, the right, the obligation to use weapons against citizens to get them to pay taxes? We use weapons against citizens to get them to not compete in government monopolies like interest rates, like currency creation and manipulation and so on. Do we want to give these people a monopoly of power in society? Do we think that a monopoly of violence is going to lead to anything good in the long run? The evidence seems to say no. And there's great moral reasons for that. The initiation of violence, which is the essence of the state, is not moral or acceptable in practice. Creating a magic other universe called the public sector doesn't change moral rules. Government workers don't get to fly, they don't get to reverse time, they're not subject to opposing laws of physics, neither are they subject to opposing laws of morality. That which is immoral for you and me is immoral for the state. The initiation of force, the counterfeiting of money, the enslavement of others unwillingly and sometimes even unborn through intergenerational debt is immoral for us, it's immoral for the state. Having one universal moral rule is the only way forward for mankind. That must lead us to at least question the existing configuration of a society